Thanks everyone for joining. This will be the last Adaptive Cards community call for the year, but we've got a pretty, I've already actually started planning the January and February calls. So we've got a mix. The last two, we've had a mix of our community joining in, which I very much appreciate. Last year we had, last month, we had Imaginein showing some really cool AI recognition with turning a photo into a card. And this month, we've got Maik Hummel from a company called Neohelden in Germany, who's been using adaptive cards for a while to power this custom digital assistant really designed for businesses. And their entire stack is on Flutter, which is a cross-platform UI framework, similar to React Native, similar to Xamarin. And he's going to show the adaptive cards renderer for Flutter, which has been around. I don't know, maybe he'll tell us what the state of it is. It's in like a 1.0 or if people would be interested in checking it out. But yeah, so we're going to do a bit of a deep dive this month. Next month, as we head into 2021, we'll do a little bit more power user focused stuff. So power platform focused stuff is kind of on the agenda. So I'll try not to have too much deep stuff all at once and bring in some of the high level, but we do have a pretty diverse audience with a diverse set of interests and a diverse set of skill sets. So keep me posted. I forgot to make a survey. I'll try and make a survey while Mike is presenting, and just let us know if you like the content we're doing, if you'd like to change things up. I'll drop my mail in, always receptive to feedback on this, but it is a little bit of a balancing act to make sure you're all enjoying what we're doing. So with that, I have another edition of, I'm just going to hand it over to Mike, and he's going to walk us through what they've been doing, and we'll bring it back for a Q&A at the end. The Q&A can be on anything, by the way, so feel free to raise your hand. If this is your first call, welcome. We do like to keep these pretty casual, so, click the little hand up button, post questions in chat, and we'll be monitoring that throughout. And with that, I will just hand it right over.
Thank you, Matt. I also like it to keep it interactive, so if anybody has a question while presenting, just shoot them out. I'm very happy to answer them all. So first of all, thank you, Matt, for the chance to present what we are doing as a company, and also what we are doing with adaptive cards and Flutter so far. As a bit of background, I myself am the CTO of Neohelden, and what we are focusing on are digital assistants for the enterprise area. So pretty similar to Alexa or Siri, but only focusing on enterprise use cases. So we have our digital assistants currently in place, especially with German companies. A few of them are, for example, Siemens or Volkswagen or Hermes UK, where we are experimenting with the new technology, which is capable of understanding natural language, for example, and also building processes and conversations, which enables you as somebody who has stuff to do, like real stuff, not only weather or recipes or something, to do your job faster and better. So essentially we have two parts, one of which is understanding natural language, and the other one is implementing processes faster and giving them in putting them into a conversation. And the difficult part, which we always have to deal with, is organizing and structuring information. And the thing is, it's not only us who is developing and configuring those processes and flows, it's also our customers. And back then, I guess it was 2018 already, we went out and looked for some way to format information, essentially. And this is where we got into adaptive cards. And we had a look at a website and saw, okay, you can use a JSON format to essentially align information quite easily and make it in some forms interactive, but so easy to use that also our customers could use it on their own and configure and define their own cards to just present the information to the customer. And this essentially was why we decided to go with adaptive cards. So we started out in 2018 with an application which was based on React.js. And we pretty quickly got into adaptive card.js, and it worked pretty good. And just what you can see over here. And bear with me, this will be completely live. So if anything happens, if anything goes wrong, this is the odds might be against me. So I have like one simulator and 3 other stuffs running and a remote connection to a Windows machine. So I hope all goes well in this part. So what you can see here is our client, which is running on React.js and is using Adaptive Card.js. So it looks pretty casual. We designed it a bit, we tweaked it a bit, but essentially it's the plain Adaptive Card.js implementation, which we can use to put in adaptive cards into our conversation. So we can talk to our assistant, we can write with our assistant, and he responds in some form. And this is now a test flow, which we use to check that everything is fine with our adaptive card implementation and also is being rendered properly in our client. And these are essentially the example cards which are available on the Adaptive Cards.io website. And what you're seeing here is the version we went for about 2 years, I guess, which is the React.js version. We put it natively on different kind of operating systems using Cordova and using Electron. So essentially we developed the application using React.js and put it natively onto different operating systems, especially iOS, Android, macOS, and Windows, using Electron and Cordova. And this works quite good. I mean, the development flow itself is sometimes a bit tweaky because you have the rendering engine, which is most often based on WebKit technologies. But in some terms, it's difficult to get, for example, native performance, especially when you're dealing with a conversation, because a conversation can get pretty long if you are talking to your assistant for about 2 or 3 hours, and then performance matters. And in this case, we experienced a few drawbacks from using the casual web-based approach to developing such an application and decided, okay, we need some other technology. And in 2018, already then Flutter came around. Back then it was quite early and the whole community didn't catch up already. And now we are in some form in a hype and a lot of people are learning about Flutter. But before we jump into Flutter itself, just want to show you what it looks like, in this case, in the web version in Flutter. So this is the exact same assistant, so to say, but a whole different application. So we have the same features, we can use it the same way, but it's all written in Dart using Flutter as the framework, and we completely re-implemented our own assistant with a new technology while maintaining backwards compatibility with all the other features we had with our React.js version and our Cordova and Electron version. And what you can see here is the very same test flow of those adaptive cards. They are rendered a bit different sometimes, as we are currently still stabilizing the web support, but essentially it looks nearly identical. Like this is what it looks like with React.js and Adaptive Card.js, and this is what it looks like using Flutter, in this case, on web.
And Mike, could I ask a quick question right here?
Yeah.
So when you say you're stabilizing the web stuff, so what's the current status of Flutter? Was it like Xamarin and originally going after like Android and iOS, or even React Native, which you had Android and iOS, but then React Native for web was a community supported thing. Is web supported out of the box, or what's the status of that?
That's a perfect question to go over to the next screen. Currently, Flutter is fully supported on iOS and Android. So Flutter in general is a framework for building applications which are focused on good performance. To be completely, like, to put it in simple terms, they are focusing on performant UI applications, which you can build quite easily with a lot of defaults, which make it quite easy to use it. As of right now, it works on iOS and Android, but they are already working on desktop. And earlier this year, they announced stable support for macOS. And they're currently working on getting it stable on web. So building websites with Flutter will be a thing which can already be done and it works quite good, but there are a few drawbacks, a few issues, as it is still in the process of being stabilized. And the same thing also applies for desktop, especially for Microsoft and Windows, as they are still struggling with supporting all platforms, as they are completely like they started from scratch in building those applications. So iOS and Android can be used in production. Definitely, we are already running our apps in production using iOS and Android. And in the future, and I don't know when this future will be, in the future, web and desktop will also be supported. And they are also working on fancy stuff like embedded devices where you don't even need an operating system to run a Flutter application, like directly on an embedded device without any kind of hardware behind it, only the embedded stuff. And this might be quite interesting. The cool thing about it is it's the first framework I know so far. So I come from a background back then using Flex applications and Flash with ActionScript 3, building mobile application with Flex. It worked back then, but it was like a pain. Then there was Cordova and React Native and Xamarin, for example. And Flutter is the first time I have subjectively the feeling we have a truly cross-platform framework which can really be used across different kind of operating systems without the overhead you, for example, had when developing React Native applications. So to be honest about it, it's still early, but more and more developers are joining the Flutter train. And I personally think this might be one of the best UI frameworks, which has been there since I remember developing applications. So you can use it on mobile, web, and desktop. And the cool thing about it is they are focusing on performance. So most often, it's also what they directly say on the website. They look for 60 FPS. So essentially, you could also use Flutter to build mobile games or games in general. And this was also one of the things which we found pretty interesting when thinking about UI performance and the customer benefits if the application feels completely smooth. And this is why we decided to jump on the Flutter train and try to get our assistant running with Flutter, even though we knew there might be support lacking, especially considering the plugin ecosystem. So a few general things which you expect from a major framework or a major platform might be lacking as of right now for all different platforms. Like a few plugins are supported on mobile, and a few are supported on web and desktop too. But the ecosystem itself is stabilizing, so it's only a matter of time until a plugin supports mobile, web, and desktop, as those native touch points still need a native implementation. So as soon as you're, for example, talking about microphone implementation or getting the GPS data or something else, you need those native touch points. And this is where, for example, even though we are using Flutter for the whole application and the whole UI, you have the native touch points where you need, for example, Swift for iOS, or you need C# or C++ on Windows, or Java or Kotlin on Android. So it's just a matter of time until it stabilizes.
Yeah, it's an ambitious bet. I mean, React Native, is making a very similar, ambitious bet. And I will probably maybe over this holiday break do some investigation between the two. Are they doing it a lot? Like React Native, I think, has been doing a pretty good job, Facebook specifically, in really engaging with the community to drive it. Would you say Flutter's in a similar state, or is it still pretty much run out of the core company at this point?
From what I can tell, and we are also active in engaging the Flutter community by doing, for example, the Flutter Coffee Show, and also hosting a regional meetup about Flutter. The community is pretty supportive, and most people still know that we are in some terms a minority of developers using Flutter as of right now, but the support is quite good, and more people, especially newcomers who are getting into developing applications and are getting into mobile development, they are going especially with Flutter. And Most often because the major difference between React Native and Flutter in this part is for React Native, still sometimes or most often need two different implementations for different UI rendering styles, for example. There are a few abstraction frameworks which try to make it a bit easier, but you still have sometimes two different UI views which you have to develop. In terms of Flutter, it's identical, the very same code, not only for iOS and Android, but also for macOS, Windows, Linux, and web, and maybe embedded later on, or Fuchsia as an operating system. And this is pretty sick because you only have to write it once and you can run it on any platform. And this is what React Native came up in the first place when they announced how React Native should work. But to be very honest about it, they never really supported all of the operating system or all of the platforms which they intended to support in the first place. Yeah. So I personally hope that Flutter is really able to provide stable support, especially stable and working production-ready support for all the platforms they are currently targeting on.
So with the adaptive card stuff, how, well, I don't mean to but to get it, I guess, since I'm interested in this, but I can imagine, I guess we should focus more on the adaptive card stuff as well. So how would you say that's going? Like implementing the renderer, maintaining it, you've got it on web, Android, iOS. Does it work in desktop? Like what are some of the stuff that, like what's the status with the adaptive card implementation you've been working on? Or if you were going to get there, that's okay to get there too. Yeah. I just want to pepper my own curiosity on this.
Not an issue. Just for all the folks in the call, like to get a hang on the technology. Like Flutter is the framework, and the programming language you're using when developing Flutter application, it's Dart. Dart and Flutter are not the same. Dart is the programming language. Flutter is in some forms the framework on top of it. And quite a lot of people who are getting into Flutter development, they are sometimes a bit worried what this Dart has to do with Flutter, for example. And Dart is only the programming language, which has been around quite for a long time, but only recently can now be used to build front-end and UI applications, and not only how it was intended in the first place for web development. So Flutter is the framework, Dart is the programming language, and we combine those two worlds, Flutter with Dart, with adaptive cards to essentially make it work for our assistant, because we figured out, okay, there is no renderer, which we can use to put adaptive cards into our maybe new application, and then decided we first have to build adaptive cards for Flutter before we could potentially be able to re-implement our own client. And I think we started by the end of 2018. I would have to look into those commits. But using the adaptive cards library in itself is pretty simple. There is a package manager available for Flutter called pub. It's available on pubdev. And as soon as you develop an application, you have, for example, similar to using npm or pip for Python, you just have to put in the dependency with the respective version. And to answer your question, Matt, we are not on a stable 1.0 release yet. We would love to put that out, but we are still in an early phase of the development of this library, but we are making huge progress in the last few months and years to get it more and more stable and to support more and more features. As I mean, adaptive cards is already pretty powerful with all the implementations, for example, also supporting media and stuff. This is something which takes some time until we got it into adaptive cards in the Flutter implementation. But we are targeting for a major release, hopefully by the mid of next year, where we can put a sign on it and say, okay, it's stable now. And we know we support all the features which also were released on the part of the adaptive card standard. To show you the desktop support, I will switch over to the next screen. And this is where I have a desktop version running on my local Mac. So this itself is the example application which we built to essentially test all the different kind of adaptive cards and all the variations we have there. So this application itself runs natively on macOS, and implements the example app. And what we have here is, for example, the normal samples, which are published on the Adaptive Cards.io website, where we have UMAT and all the different components which we just can use. Also, we can have a look at those JSON payloads we are using there. And it essentially can be used pretty similar to the Adaptive Cards.js implementation or the other libraries. But in this case, it's completely rendered natively on macOS using Flutter as the framework in the background. And we can have support for different kind of forms. We can interact, for example, also with a date picker. The date picker itself really pretty much looks like material design, as Flutter, in the way we are using it, uses the material design specification in this case, where we can, for example, also pick different kind of dates or time formats where you get a pretty decent time picker, which is already built into Flutter. So this is not something we had to build. We just had to make it compatible with the Adaptive Cards standard in this case. And this is what it looks like. And I hope the transmission is smooth. It is completely smooth. So there is no lagging behind. No matter how many cards we put in there, it is rendered pretty neat. And we put together a list of different kind of examples and also try to do the edge casing, for example. In this case, we have different kind of colors and accents we could potentially use, and emphasis and no style and container spacing. We try to put together a list of different kind of combinations which might be difficult or where we had issues in the past. For example, using columns and aligning them, stretching content. So this is a full-blown application, which in this case now runs on Mac OS natively.
And so when you code to it, can you really only use the types that are available in the Flutter framework? Like, can you only code to the UI abstraction and then they transform that UI model into native Mac, native Android, or are you writing some per platform stuff?
So you're not using like the proprietary UI components from macOS in this case.
Right.
So
yeah.
They essentially, also what they are doing with the material design stuff, they are re-implementing all those native widgets. In Flutter, you're talking about widgets, and they re-implement the style. They should have, because they are using their very own rendering engine. So to make this happen, that it renders images and stuff, they're using the so-called Skia engine. And the Skia engine itself it can be compared to, in some form, a gaming engine something like OpenGL, where you can just put any kind of canvas rendering in there. And this is what they are doing in the background to render any kind of UI. And this is also the underlying technology which enables us to use, for example, transitions in this case. So I don't think that it looks too smooth on when I press something here, but as soon as I press back, there is an animation from top down, and this will be rendered with 60 FPS, so completely smooth. And you don't have to do anything about it. And this is quite decent from the technology point of view.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I remember learning about Skia because one thing we've been trying to add in Adaptive Cards for a long time is some kind of like charting framework, even if it's just like micro charts or micrographs. And there's some that use Skia. There's some that use like canvas tile stuff, which is similar to Skia. There's some that use SVG based approaches, but we never really found one that works on every platform that Adaptive Cards supports. And that's sort of interesting, and maybe now I have a new expert I can talk to, maybe you. But we really comes up all the time on I want to put charts in my cards, and I'd be curious to kind of maybe dive into some of that future date, not in this call, but just offline to try and bring charts, because I know people want it.
Yeah, the cool thing about Flutter is they completely optimize the way they are rendering the UI and are tweaking it every time. So, for example, for charting, and also if you're working with animations, they're pretty focused on making this as smooth as possible. So you can compose your very own animations. This is what we, for example, did with the loader, you can see over here, this is like a completely customized flare animation, which we can just embed, and it runs natively. So there are frameworks like Lottie.js or Lottie in general, which can just render animations, and they run. In this case, this is web. It runs smoothly, and in this case over here, we are talking about Mac.os natively. And the cool thing about it is you don't have to care about it. It just really works without you having to tweak it again. And the cool thing is, if I switch over to the remote Windows computer I'm operating here, don't mind the debugging view over there. This is how I launched it. This is a native application running on Windows now, and it looks the very same. So I can also interact with all the samples. There might be subtle differences as it adapts to the underlying operating system and uses the fonts or for example. But if I go through the examples over here, it pretty much looks the very same like the application I just showed you on macOS. And this is completely native on Windows. And the code behind it is 100% the very same code. We didn't have to tweak anything to run this example here on Windows. It can be just used and it works. And this is also one of the few technologies I know so far where you don't have to adapt your UI for in some terms for the operating system you're running on.
And now, as a quick question, so you mentioned so you're still quite a few months away from saying this Flutter renderer for adaptive cards is like ready for broad consumption.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's any of our Imaginea friends on the call, but they maintain the React Native renderer. And one of the concepts they introduced in that renderer, they called it a theme config. And it's basically this shared JSON object that lets you get deeper in the styling of maybe I want my buttons to look and feel a certain way. So I can apply rounded corners or background colors, including things like states, like press states. Ooh, you've got a very weird set of colors there.
This is like the testing example
So the host config lets you do some things, which is our kind of concept of this shared object that works in all of our renders, but it doesn't get currently to the level of detail of like press states and hover states, like if I want my buttons to have a certain appearance. And I liked the React Native approach, that concept of a theme config. I think that was familiar for React Native developers. It's you express this JSON object and then they transform it into the right thing. They write the right Android stuff, they write the right iOS stuff. But to consumers of the React Native library, you want the card to look and feel like the rest of the app. So if they're using a particular design system, they want their buttons. We've only done our job if a user can't tell where the adaptive card is, right? Like if you're looking at an app, the card should just blend right in. So is that a concept you've added in the current one? Like how, presumably, like even if you're on the web right there, or you're on the native Windows, you can't write CSS. You have to kind of code to the abstraction that you're providing. It looks so there's theming involved in there. So is that a concept that Flutter provides, or would you expose that in adaptive cards? Because basically, if one of our apps or one of our big like host apps were to consume this, I think that's the next level of detail they would need to make sure it looks and feels like their app.
Yeah. So it's definitely doable, and we have different kind of touch points where we can support specific theming. Like Flutter has a theme concept, and you can, as you can see here, completely tweak the design. In this case, we have, for example, a dark mode, which you can just toggle, and I can just switch over to dark mode, and then all cards will be in the dark mode. And we have a mode already built into this library, which approximates the best color for the dark style, depending on your host config. So dynamically tries to approximate which dark color would match the best as soon as you switch into the dark mode. The tweaking is quite simple through the theme configuration. We currently don't have something where you can tweak single components directly. I guess if this is where where the React Native renderer is striving for. But this would be definitely something which what we can consider in the library and what we can support with this library. So the theming itself gives you the general style capabilities, but we could definitely also support tweaking like custom components like those checkboxes or those native elements which we are using here. Cool. This is definitely not yet. Maybe in a future version.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely keep that in mind as we roll it out. Like I think this is a great addition. I'm very thankful that our community fills in these things, because the Adaptive Cards promise is we work in any app on any platform, and it's hard for us to support every platform. If people are writing a Flutter app, we send them to you, and it's great that you guys have filled that in. Same thing with React Native. If people are building React Native apps, we send them to our folks at Imaginea, who have been super helpful. The code is in the root Adaptive Cards GitHub. That offer still stands if you want to move this over there or maintain your own repo. That's totally fine. But a quick question I had separate from that and related to, I think one of our devs, by the way, so Rashik, works on our Android SDK. I am nudging him to send a question in chat that he has for folks. So if anyone on the call is using Android to render cards, there's the chat right there. So take a look at that. We're not sure how far back our Android SDK needs to go. So like what's the minimum version of Android we need to support? What's the minimum SDK? So we'd like to find out from folks on the call who are using that library what your compatibility needs are. And that gets me back to this question for you, Mike. So with Flutter, what is the compatibility story with iOS, Android, even Windows? Like, for example, does Flutter support Windows 7 or Windows 8, or do you, or in Android, do you know how far it goes back? Just out of like really just curiosity.
Good question. I'm not quite confident about the Windows compatibility. I have in mind that they also strive for Windows 7 compatibility, like Windows 10 for sure. Mm-hmm. But I think they also wanted to target Windows 7 too. It should work, I guess.
Okay. Well, sure, yeah. If they're just using like Skia as like this, this very low level rendering platform, then yeah, I could see that making sense.
Yeah. About Android compatibility, I don't know the exact version, but it goes pretty deep back until like versions which usually shouldn't be around anymore. So I guess the support has the critical mass where you can use it in production so far for Android and also for iOS. One thing to mention about it is a few plugins and a few modules which you can use with Flutter. They bump the least supported version a bit higher, like when you do native stuff, like accessing the microphone like we do, or push notification stuff, or GPS location. Then, as it also is with Cordova or React Native plugins, this pushes the least compatible version a bit higher.
Right. Okay.
But in general, the support is so good that all recent devices are supported by Flutter. And I think it's like a compromise to say, okay, we support all the most recent without having too much maintenance to do for all those old platforms.
Yeah. Cool.
I just want to show, like, this is now Mac OS running. This is native Windows running, and this is the web implementation. So it's running in Chrome in this case. So if you want to build the application in a way where you can use it on all operating systems and all platforms, this is something which also works on web. And earlier this year, the support was not completely there yet, and we tried it back then, and a few things weren't aligned properly, or a few pieces were missing, or there were pixel or rendering issues. And as of right now, when I tested it like last week again, every single feature, we were pretty it was pretty interesting to see how far web support already went, and quite a lot of the things are working properly without any issues. So you can just use those implementations pretty neat already, also on the web. with Chrome in this case. So it looks very much the very same, only running on web as the underlying platform. A few things, to be honest about it, are lacking, like, for example, the media and video support on the desktop operating systems, as they are still in the progress of getting the compatibility with all those different kind of video codecs and video and audio formats. But most of the things which are just casual rendering of cards is already working also on web. And this is quite decent, because this is then an implementation of adaptive cards which can be used across every platform, every major platform which is currently being used.
Do you know, presumably this is either just using one big canvas element and they're like painting pixels like Skia style, or is it using WebAssembly, or do you know, like, presumably this is not doing, it's not converting to HTML DOM in a traditional way. Like, this is, they're painting every pixel, is a guess I make. Do you know if that's right?
In some terms, yes, but a few things are actually written into the DOM. So you have like a pane, in this case, I don't know why it's called FLT class pane, but there are quite a lot of elements underlying it, and a few things are actually like shadow DOM elements, which are being painted properly, and also like the text elements, they are rendered using DOM in this case, but with their very own interpretation of how to do that. I'm not quite sure if they're painting pixel for pixel in terms when there are animations involved.
Right.
I'm not too deep into the web details on how they are approaching it, but in general, it's both ways. It's some DOM elements are rendered like the text stuff and the buttons and the hyperlinks, for example, and the rest are shadow DOM elements.
And those look like, I'm guessing FLT stands for Flutter. Those look like HTML5 web components. So those are custom components.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's interesting. Okay. Cool.
So you can see they are using for some parts casual CSS, and so they're not rendering every pixel, but it might be the case when we're talking about animations, like the steps in between until the element is aligned and stuff. But I'm not quite sure where this journey also will end with Flutter in the web area, as they are still dealing with a few issues as of right now. But yeah, the progress is there, and I think it will be quite stable in a few months, and can be used for quite a lot of applications.
So we are at 15 minutes to go. Does anyone have any questions I'd like to tee up for Mike? And you can keep going, but I just wanted to be kind of aware, like, so we can switch to like a dedicated Q&A. This again was a deep topic, so I don't exactly know what the exact interests of all our folks are. Thankfully, a lot of people hung around, so I very much appreciate that. And Mike going through a lot of these deep stuff, and also you guys putting up with my sort of deep questions, because as we're trying to implement these renderers, it's great to coordinate with the community and make sure we're all kind of supporting the adaptive card community as a whole, including folks who adopted Flutter. So yeah, I just wanted you to be aware on like if people want to have questions, maybe drop that in, but also Mike, just so you were aware too. we've flown through. Yeah.
So in case people in the call also want to try out how this is working, so like getting started with Flutter is quite easy. You just need to download the SDK, and most of it is just done using CLI. You like type in Flutter run, and depending on what kind of devices are plugged into your computer, it just launches pretty much immediately without any overhead or any setup or something. So if you want to try it out, the library itself is published on PubDev. So PubDev is the platform where all Flutter and Dart packages are being published. You can put in adaptive cards over there, and you will find the Flutter adaptive cards library. So this version we have released there is pretty new, so bear with us. This is still an early release. We are not fully compliant with the latest specification of adaptive cards, but we highly appreciate feedback from the community using using this plugin and also like seeing it being adopted by other developers and just it being used in the field. So if you want to use it, you just have to add a dependency, and we have 3 different kind of options if you want to load an adaptive card. So you can provide a normal host config, and if you want to load a card, we have 3 different modes, one of which is the normal network mode. Network means you can load an adaptive cards through a hyperlink, like a URL, and it can be anywhere, and it will be downloaded, and it will be rendered and just shown. You can also just embed a local JSON file in Flutter. We are always talking about assets, so you can just use adaptive card asset, then put in the JSON configuration, also a path for your host config, and it will then be displayed. And otherwise, you can just use adaptive card memory. For example, this is the way also we are using it in our application. If you're receiving it through a network request, or when you have a WebSocket connection to your backend and you're just getting the stuff, and you have a few callbacks which you can use, like for example on submit, when you click the submit button, or on open URL, where you can specify what should happen in those cases, how to open the URL, how to do the submit actions, and where to transmit the data then. And this is pretty much how you can get started using Flutter in adaptive cards, or adaptive cards in Flutter, this way around.
Awesome. And so that really helps. Brad just gave me a call out about keeping the blog in sync. It is not. So Mike, one thing I'll maybe set up with you is if you and I can coordinate getting some of this written down on a quick summary, we can publish it on the Adaptive Cards blog. Potentially, I really leave it up to Dana's discretion if this is M365 developer focused or not, but we'll get the content out there so we can at least write down how people can get started. And then in light of that, so making sure we just get this written down, there was a question. He would like to hear some of the challenges when building the custom renderer. You know, where'd you find yourself spending the most time when developing the renderer, for example?
Good questions. The 2 guys which primarily developed the adaptive cards library, and I'm not the one who had to jump into the bad bugs, like the really bad ones, is most often when you have to do aligning, like the different aligning modes, which adaptive card supports, which are quite a bit different when dealing, for example, with web development, where you can use the Flexbox model and you just put something on the right and something on the left and something in the center. And a few patterns weren't too good supported by Flutter in some terms, which was quite tricky. And the other one were just plain bugs, which we came around and recognized. We have one workaround, for example, in place. As we had rendering issues, we also have it in the README, as we have a special flag toggles the support for the Markdown renderer. As by default, the Markdown can be used to just print out something bold, for example. And we had severe issues with rendering some of the stuff, and just getting down into this rabbit hole and figuring out, okay, this is not something we do wrong on our side, but in this case, it was a Flutter bug and an engine bug, which sometimes happens in such edge cases. This is something which really takes time. And then you have a few test scenarios which you're trying to get a hang on and understand why the rendering fails in this case, or why there's an overflow. Like in Flutter, you're talking about overflows as soon as an element tries to be bigger than it should be. And just figuring out why this happens is sometimes really, really difficult. And like Norbert and Pascal from my team, like they all tackled the difficult bugs. Like sometimes it took about 3 or 4 or 5 days just to figure out why this rendering at some special use case goes wrong. And this is something which I guess applies to any kind of software development. But in this case, we also had struggle, as we started pretty early in 2018 back then. Most issues were when we recognized Flutter, or when there were Flutter engine issues, essentially. And then you need a workaround, or you need to wait for the fix upstream. And this is quite difficult sometimes. But
yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, you're on the bleeding edge. You're gonna find that stuff, and the hope is that you've got a great feedback channel to bubble these things up. And so, quick question on that. So, Markdown's a very interesting one. It pairs very well with adaptive cards, but we've had bugs based on it. So, is the Flutter Markdown package, is that a community thing, or like that you were using, or is that something you guys had to implement your own Markdown processing?
No, the Flutter Mark is good to say, something officially supported. So we don't have to implement it on our own. This would be quite challenging. It's something which the folks from Google developed and are maintaining also. So Flutter Markdown in itself was gladly not something we had to develop on our own.
Okay, cool. Gotcha.
And also, we are making use of a few plugins, like, for example, also the video player, especially for like just playing the media content, as this is something which, we could never do on our own without somebody being capable of dealing with all those video formats and stuff. And this is also where quite interesting bugs can happen with state management, or also when you're dealing with switching between the full screen mode and getting back to the normal mode, and for example preventing re-renders or wrong displays. So the typical UI stuff, especially when dealing with mobile platforms and switching between different kind of UI states.
Right. Mike, let me just take over for 1 sec and put in some summary stuff. If you had any interest, if people reach out to you, feel free to put your mail in the chat. I actually didn't add it here, but I did just want to kind of close with a couple of resources. So I put a link to the survey in the chat. It'll be our last one. It's a pretty short survey. Great opportunity for us, to learn from you folks and make sure we're tailoring not only the product for your needs, but also the community calls themselves. So always, here's a good list of links to check out the roadmap, get started with adaptive card templating, which you can start doing today. Some, where the code lives. Always like to plug madewithcards.io. It's a really great community supported site where people can share some really cool adaptive cards they've been using. So make sure you check out madewithcards.io. There's also a handful of other Microsoft 365 developer calls that always great content, so make sure you check those out. We are in the Q&A, and then the last thing I wanted to say is this call will be recorded and uploaded to the YouTube. I will do my best to work with Mike, and we'll get a quick blog post summarizing this stuff. And the next call will be January 14th in the year 2021, same time, 9 a.m. PST. So we're hoping you'll be there. It will most likely be focused on a little bit more Teams and Power Platform stuff is the current plan. So we'll again, I'm trying to oscillate between some deep code heavy stuff and also some content for our Power Platform users and our M365 developers who are integrating in some of the Microsoft apps. So we'll swing the pendulum back the other direction as we start the next year. Appreciate so much, Mike, coming in here and everyone for engaging in the conversation. I will switch it back to Q&A. Mike, anything you want to say to close off? And then I can actually stay on. We might stop the recording, but we can maybe stay on and talk some specifics if people are interested. But anything you want to say to close out, Mike?
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all. If you want to try out Flutter or adaptive cards, I can just recommend it, and feedback would be highly appreciated. And nothing else to add on this side. I hope we can support the adaptive cards ecosystem by providing a good, stable Flutter implementation and
awesome.
Further, make this journey happen.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks, everyone. We'll wrap up probably the recording part of this right now. And I'm happy to stick around if people really want to really dive into what the heck is Dart or anything like that. Mike, are you able to stick around for a few minutes?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay.